Thank you all, friends, for being here today for this talk on the heritage around this area. I thank Dr. Nandita Krishna and the C.P. Ramaswami Ayar Foundation for having invited me today to deliver this talk. This venue happens to be one of my favorite venues in the city, the Kalyana Kudam of the Grove, and it also was a favorite venue of the late Mr. Muthaya. And so I'm very happy to be here to give this particular talk. When Dr. Nandita asked me as to what I would like to speak about, I said, in the last few years, when people in certain localities have invited me, I have preferred to speak about those localities themselves. So I started that with Madipakam a few years ago, then the Women's Christian College, and now here. And later in this week, I'm talking about the heritage of the Meenambakam area. So I think that it's very necessary for people to be aware of what is around them, and that is why this particular topic. So I begin with a map of Madras, or rather a map of the long tank of Mylapore, which is what you can see over there, and everything to the east of it. You can see from here. So this is Pudupet, long tank, Teynampet, and then you've got Alwarpet, then you've got Mylapore, you've got Santhome, and so on. And this particularly, the long tank and Mylapore define the contours of the area that we are talking about today, which is Teynampet and Alwarpet. The long tank of Mylapore, as you all know, was a lake of 77 acres span and had around 300 acres of catchment, all of which vanished over a period of time in order to make way for T Nagar and then the surrounding areas. And with that, we seem to have lost a significant water body, and we also have alignments which don't seem to make any sense any longer. For instance, why does Mount Road take such a big curve when it comes down this particular stretch? Why could it not go straight? That's because there was a huge water body over here and we haven't changed it. Why do we still have some strange temples in these locations like Vellathil Mudandu and the Mariamman Kovil? Where is the Vellam? And then things like this. They've all lost their meaning over a period of time. They are standing in land. But if you look at them in connection with the water, why did we have houses that were named Waterside, for instance? They've all vanished. The significance of the name goes away when you destroy the most important water body in that particular area. But the Alwarpet and Teynampet, they form very significant localities of the city. And I thought I will just start by defining the principal boundaries of Teynampet, Alwarpet as they stand today. And so we have Cenotaph Road, which is recorded at least from early in the 19th century as being at the intersection of Teynampet village and Mount Road. I am not going to go into how Teynampet and Alwarpet got their names because I have not come across any authoritative account of how those names came about. Even H.D. Love's Vestiges of Old Madras just has a one-word mention of Alwarpet and Teynampet. It does not associate any history with them. So we just assume that they were two villages that existed and they became part of the city of Madras. Cenotaph Road, we can start with that. So in the 1790s, Tipu Sultan and Hyder Ali, his father, in the 1780s, were considered to be invincible by the British in Madras. They were terrified of both of them. Hyder Ali died during the Second Anglo-Mysore War, and Tipu Sultan, it was neither a victory nor a defeat, but the British were quite afraid. And most of the residents, the British residents of Madras, preferred to live within the confines of Fort St. George, never to come out, because they were afraid that any time there would be a raid by Tipu Sultan. So at this time, you had Lord Cornwallis coming smarting from his defeat at the hands of George Washington in America. And what happens when you are trounced or thrashed by someone? You look for a smaller victim over whom you can establish your hegemony. So he comes here and he says, we need to teach Tipu Sultan a lesson. So there is the third Anglo-Mysore war that is fought in 1792, in which Tipu Sultan is defeated but not killed, and enormous war reparation debts are imposed upon him. His two sons are taken as hostages and brought to Madras and treated very well. And Tipu Sultan, to give him credit, repays the war damages and takes his sons back. In the meantime, Cornwallis has resigned his commission as Governor General of India and he has gone back to England. But the British in Madras, who have now suddenly acquired a sense of safety, and they are moving in various directions in the city, including Teynampet, to which we will come, they decide that a statue for Cornwallis has to be erected, public funding, and finally a statue is made by Thomas Banks in England, marble statue, and it arrives in Madras early in the 19th century, erected inside Fort St. George, facing Parade Square, facing west, under a canopy which is a copy of the Rohilla War Monument in Calcutta. And that is where the statue is standing. Cornwallis once again becomes Governor General. You know, it's always a mistake to take up the same job again. But he becomes Governor General, arrives in Madras, salutes his own statue, conducts a parade under it, and then departs for Calcutta, and dies as soon as he reaches Bengal of a disease known as Bengal liver, and is buried in Ghazipur over there. The British in Madras then decide that we need a bigger monument for Cornwallis. The statue inside the fort is not impressive enough. So they decide that they will build a cenotaph, a huge rotunda, which will be at the intersection of Teynampet and Mount Road. And they decide that the statue will be shifted there from Fort St. George. So the rotunda is constructed early in the 1800s, so 1810 or so. Statue is still standing facing west under the cupola inside Parade Square in Fort St. George. And for 100 years it remains that way. Government doesn't do anything fast. I'm sure files were continuously being looked at and they were saying, yeah, that statue, yes, it has to make the journey, but we'll do it next year. Eventually 95 years go by, and then in 1905 they suddenly wake up, by which time Cenotaph Road has become a landmark. The British have begun taking rides around the rotunda in the evenings, because now Tipu Sultan is not a threat anymore, he's dead. And after that, in 1905, they extract the statue from where it is and they decide that it will make the journey to Teynampet. But at that time, the rotunda is no longer in Teynampet. Much to their surprise, and nobody knows how, it has made the journey all the way to First Line Beach, where it is standing in front of Benting's building. And so they reverse direction. The statue, instead of moving south, moves north, and finally goes and stands under the cupola, which was built for it 95 years earlier. But then the salt water of the sea begins attacking the marble. One morning it's yellow, next day it's green, third day it's black. So they decide that they are going to shift the statue once again. So now the statue moves to the Connemara Public Library, and there it remains till 1935, when Rajaji becomes Chief Minister, 1936-37, and he says that this statue should not be in a public location. It needs to be moved back into Fort St. George. Nothing happens till independence. And then the statue has to be moved. They say, that smaller canopy which was inside Parade Square, let's move it there. But that canopy is no longer where it was. It has now moved to the front of the Fort St. George. So canopy has moved, rotunda has moved, statue has moved. So statue comes back, but it is not put under the canopy. It is shifted into Fort Museum. And there is a distance between that wall and this wall separating the two of them. Statue inside the building, canopy outside. The name Cenotaph Road remains for a cenotaph that doesn't exist any longer. Cenotaph is still in front of Benting's building, where it is the largest urinal in the whole of Rajaji Saleh. In the evenings, you will also find some merrymakers lying there, oblivious of the stench of the urine all around them. So it's a place where there is a lot of spiritual uplift. We'll leave it at that. So that is the history of Cenotaph Road. We now come to Mowbrays Road. George Mowbray, very senior functionary of the East India Company, 1792, the year is very significant because that was the year, as I said, Tipu Sultan defeated. George Mowbray acquires a huge parcel of land along the river Adyar from the estate of he acquires a large parcel of land along the river Adayar, 100 acres or so, and puts up what is known as Mowbrays cupola, which is presently the Madras Club. And that would become his residence. And he would drive every weekend from Fort St. George to this cupola to spend time. And therefore a road came to be developed all along, starting from roughly where the Music Academy signal is today, going all the way up to the Adayar River. And there was nothing in between. They were all paddy fields. And that was a road that only one man was taking every weekend. So it was named after him. It became Mowbrays Road. It ends up in a 100-acre property, at the entrance of which is a place known as Adayar Gate and Adayar Club Gate Road. That is the name, because Mowbrays Cupola eventually becomes the Adayar Club. And the gate for the Adayar Club was where Amma Nana is standing today. So that is why the road that goes from there into the club is known as the Adayar Club Gate Road. That development is a separate story which we don't need to go into today. But Adayar Club eventually becomes the Madras Club, and there it still remains with the name Adayar Club Gate Road leading towards it. And Mowbrays Road eventually becomes TTK Road. TTK did not live on Mowbrays Road, incidentally. He lived on Cathedral Road in a house called Shanti. But when you try to rename something known as Cathedral Road, you normally think twice. And so it didn't work out. And therefore Mowbrays was long dead. He was not going to protest. So they decided that it would become T.T. Krishnamachari Road. And that is the name that the road has even today. So that in effect is Mowbrays Road. Now we come to Eldams Road. For a city that adds a Y where it doesn't exist, it seems to have very conveniently dropped a Y where it should have existed. So Eldam is the correct spelling, but we decided to be fashionable. And we didn't want to be accused of saying, hello, is that yum yum yummy yumpy? So we decided that we will call it Eldam. But his real name, sadly, was Richard Eldam. He was a free merchant, not in East India Company service. Originally, yes. But later on, towards the end of the 18th century, he became a free merchant, enormously corrupt, made a lot of money, became the mayor of Madras. And he was so corrupt as the mayor of Madras that the office of the mayor was suspended thereafter. But he would not give up his position as mayor, and he held on to it till the year he died. The records say very clearly that towards the end of the 18th century, this man, Richard Eldam, bought 1.5 acres of land in the Teynampet area and built a house known as Luz House. Now, this is where all the confusion begins, because Luz House, as we know of it, is in Luz Church Road. It is behind the Kamadhenu Theatre. And, today only a part of it is there, but it is there. And so, the question is, was that stretch also a part of Teynampet at one time and later assigned to Mylapore? This is a question that arises. The second question is, was Eldams Road effectively from Alwarpet Signal going all the way up to Luz House, and thereafter there is Luz Church Road, and eventually was that stretch forgotten and renamed as Luz Church Road over a period of time? So these are certain mysteries. Certainly a house here cannot be named Luz House, because this is not the Luz area. The Luz happens to be there. So, but not all that far away also if you look at it. So therefore, we have Eldams Road as well. Now, in Eldams Road today, the Grove is one of the most significant properties that we can think of. And we come to the story of John Bruce Norton. I have made a mistake there. John Bruce Norton is the correct name. Advocate General in the 1870s, resigns and then goes back to England. His son being the very famous Eardley Norton. So, John Bruce Norton was the lawyer, Advocate General, Government of Madras, very well known for two very famous cases. One establishing the rights of Sibaganga as a zamindari, and the other establishing the rights of the Tanjore Ranis post the takeover of the kingdom in the doctrine of lapse. Incidentally, in case you thought the doctrine of lapse is dead, you'll be interested to know that any property in the city is subject to doctrine of lapse. It goes to certain vested interests. I don't have to explain any further. But that is how the doctrine of lapse has had a modern avataram today. You just have to show that your property is derelict and nobody is interested in it, and you'll find 3 people come and take it over. So what Dalhousie was doing at one point of time is still being very healthily practiced in Madras city. But let's go back to the story. So Norton was very, very well known as a prominent lawyer and advocate general, and it was he who acquired a property spanning 13 acres over here and named it the Baobab. And that is how the property acquires its name. In the 1870s, it seems, when Norton was going back, the property was divided and sold. And thereafter, it has a very interesting history, for which I will read from Shakuntala Jagannathan's book, Sir C.P. Remembered. Shakuntala Jagannathan, incidentally, Dr. Nandita Krishna's mother. And she writes thus: "It was part of an extensive property once called the Baobab, named after a rare African tree in its midst." I am now told by Dr. Nandita that that claim is hotly contested. But it belonged to John Bruce Norton, father of the famous barrister Eardley, who in turn sold part of it around the year 1875 to P. Chensal Rao Pantulu, the first Registrar General of Madras. The latter sold part of the land to Kanjivaram Venkata Subbayar, who signed as Venkata Subbayya in official documents according to the Andhra custom, and C.R. Pattabhirama Ayar, CP's, they were respectively CP's maternal grandfather and CP's father. These were the 2 people who would buy the property. The house on the original plot was sold by Chensal Rao to a famous Unani physician, father of Sir Muhammad Usman, Tatha's contemporary. And then there is a very beautiful description of the property which I think merits reading. At the time of the purchase, the property was vast and included the northern part of the present C.P. Ramaswami Ayar Road on the east, and Sitama Road, named after my grandmother, and adjoining properties to the south. The area surrounding Mowbrays Road consisted of paddy fields, where rice was grown even till the early 1950s. A water channel flowed through the southern side of the property, connecting the Mambalam and Mylapore tanks. In 1903, a tank was built adjoining Mowbrays Road. A line of casuarina trees and Chensal Rao's plantain garden demarcated the western boundary. At the time of purchase in 1882, a part of the building already existed along Eldams Road with a Y, within bracket now Eldams Road. There were also godowns, coach sheds, horse stables, cow sheds, and outhouses in the vast garden area. On this vast plot, purchased by Pattabhirama Ayar and his father-in-law in Rangammal's name, the enlarged present building was added in 1885-1886 and named the Grove after the extensive grove of trees in the area in the 19th century. The Grove property was home to deer, jackal, palm civet, peacock, and even leopard, the last seen on quite a few occasions. In fact, the whole area between Alwarpet and Mylapore consisted of paddy fields and jungle. It was for this reason that this house was built right next to the road, as the gardens were considered unsafe to walk through at night. Today, we would consider this area unsafe to walk through for other reasons, because of gig workers, everybody violating the traffic and coming in exactly the opposite direction. Would you believe it? Yesterday, I had 2 separate incidents of people texting and coming and falling on my car. So this is the level of traffic awareness we have in the city. So I think leopards were far better off not coming here any longer. Then we come to, in Teynampet, perhaps the most famous locality that we can think of is what is known as Poes Garden today, but originally just Poes Garden. So like Eldams Road dropping the Y, this seems to have regressed. And Poes Garden, anyway, in India we never know where to put the apostrophe, so it's all right. So, and when to use it. So it became Poes Gardens, and Poes Gardens was the residence of a Mr. Poe, who was a member of the, who was a merchant, member of the East India Company, later became a free merchant. The access to Poes Garden, incidentally, was not from Cathedral Road, because Cathedral Road at that time did not exist. And so we just go back a few slides. Let me go back here and point out from this. So if you remember, this was Mount Road. And it was here roughly that we have Poes Gardens today. The access was from here. And that is why there is a road even today there which ends nowhere, and it's called Poes Road. Poes Road originally was supposed to connect to Poes Gardens. And Poes Gardens had a house for a very long time right at the entrance near Cathedral Road, which later became the Railway Tribunal building. It was a house known as Waterton. That was the original house that defined Poes Garden. And later, when the managing director of Binny, Kenneth K., was killed by a snake bite in College Road in a house called Eccleston, Binny decided that that property was not auspicious for their company. So in the 1920s, they purchased Poes Gardens and put up 4 bungalows in it. One bungalow still survives. If you walk deep inside Poes Gardens and near the Jayalalitha's residence and then take a turn to the left, you'll find that the original bungalow is still there. And later, Binny's directors found that this was very noisy because Cathedral Road had been developed. Can you imagine what their tolerance to noise would have been? And so they decided to develop the boat club area. And that is how they shifted there, and that is how the entire boat club history then starts in the 1960s. It's very interesting that today we have a Binny Road leading from Cathedral Road into Poes Gardens. That was known as Binny's Gardens. It was not known as Binny's Road. It's only in the 1970s that this name of Binny's Road seems to have come. It was known only as Binny's Gardens because of the bungalows that were there at that point of time. So that is the story of Poes Gardens. Now we come back to the lake, the long tank of Mylapore. So the long tank of Mylapore, most interestingly, today you've got what is called the Semmuri Punga, once the Agri-Horticultural Society Gardens, and then you've got the Gemini flyover, and then on the other side you have got what is the erstwhile Gemini Studios property, which is today Parsons and so many other things. Now that was a huge property in its time in the 1800s, known as Springs Gardens. And Springs Gardens is where motion picture producers combined would come up later, which in turn would become Gemini Studios. For some time, that was also a stately home that belonged to Sir C. Madhavan Nair, Sir C. Shankaran Nair. The Congress Party held its meetings in Springs Gardens. Most significantly, the boating regattas of Madras would start in the long tank of Mylapore at the corner of Springs Gardens. So today, where we turn into G.N. Chetty Road, you can imagine that that was where the boating regattas would start. And from there, they would go all the way up to Cenotaph. And that is where the regattas would end. And one of the favorite viewing spots of that particular boating regattas was this property, which was known as Blacker's Gardens. Blacker's Gardens is where today you have the Congress grounds and the building standing in front of it. And this Blacker's Garden was right at the edge of the water of the long tank of Mylapore. So people could go there, they could stand and they could watch how the regatta was going, who was winning, who was falling behind, etc. And next to it, today we still have the Rai Memorial Hospital. That building stands on a house that was known as Waterside. So you know that the lake was just behind as well, because that was the building that stood in that corner. Facing this, of course, is Abbotsbury and Rostrever's Garden. Rostrever's Garden still stands as the railway bungalow, but Abbotsbury is today the Hyatt Residency. And I'm not sure how many of you are aware, but between the 1950s, 60s and 70s, to be married at Abbotsbury meant that you had a certain social cachet that others did not have. So if you did not get married at home, which was the true blue aristocracy, because they wouldn't go looking for Kalyana Mandapams, then you went to Abbotsbury. If you didn't get Abbotsbury, you went to Dharma Prakash in Pursavakam. And thereafter you slid rapidly down the social scale. But then you didn't matter. But Abbotsbury, so many society mommies have told me, Abbotsbury la nadandhathu kalyanam, And yeah, you didn't have to ask who sang because they'll tell you MS Estam Padina. So that was how weddings were conducted. I have had a tally. I found that many of the Abbotsbury weddings didn't end happily. But that is a story for another. Some did, I'm sure, but many did not. One of the ladies told me, "Anga or abbot bury pannirukra edathila eppadi kalyanam nallapadiya nadakkum." So that was Abbotsbury for you. Now we go back to Chencel Rao. I couldn't find a portrait of his, but his son Panini Rao and his grandsons, this photograph is there with a beautiful account of the Chencel Rao property as a blog on the internet. I would request that you go there and read it yourself. It gives you an idea of how the Chencel Rao property was, how the house was, etc., etc. We then come to some of the most other famous residents of this particular section. I don't have to even talk about him. A person who still lives as a personality in our midst, whom we all know, and his contributions have all been documented. So I'm going to though I'm very tempted to talk forever on him, I will not. But he was my father's hero. And my father would remember how, as a student cycling across Eldams Road, one of the big thrills was to look over the compound and see Sir CP sitting under the mandapam doing Sandhya Vandanam or something in the morning. My father would say, "Eppadi irpar theriyuma, Maharaja mari irpar." And then Dad would go ahead somewhere else. But that was one of his abiding memories. But then, so that was him. The neighbor, what was the rest of Chencel Rao's property, was a house that became Teynampet Gardens, the residence of Sir Muhammad Usman. Sir Muhammad Usman, practitioner of Unani medicine like his father, member of the Justice Party, later acting as governor of Madras, finally becoming a member of the Viceroy's Executive Council. Incidentally, between this house and Teynampet Gardens, there is a strong Rotary connection as well. Sir CP was, after all, the first district governor of Rotary in South India. Muhammad Usman was one of the early district governors after that. The Rotary Club of Madras certainly owes a lot to these two properties, because I'm sure they must have been guiding its future for a considerable period of time. Muhammad Usman, of course, is remembered in Usman Road in T Nagar, the road that we all know. Incidentally, Teynampet Gardens doesn't survive, but there is a multi-storied building there called Usman Court. Even now, if you go into that street, you'll be able to see it just next to it. We come to the street itself. There is Teynampet Gardens, there is the Grove. In between them, there is the street known as H.D. Raja Street. Harihara Dharma Raja, that was his full name, a man who began as a freedom fighter and as a strong socialist who believed that violence was the only way in which you could get independence. He did not believe in Gandhian principles. H.D. Raja is the man on this side, and the other one with a cigarette in his mouth is T.S. Narayan Swami of India Cements. Now, H.D. Raja would be arrested twice during independence movement, would come out, later on become a politician, stand for election formed his own political party, would stand from Bombay, win the election, become a member of parliament, but was also a strong believer in industrialization and business. So he made a fortune in insurance. And the building in which they operated, suddenly the name of the insurance company is slipping my mind, but it's still there in Second Line Beach in Georgetown. And H.D. Raja, incidentally, didn't live anywhere here, but then the street was named after him, largely at Sir C.P.'s insistence when he passed away. And that is how that particular road gets its name. Then we move on, opposite side, where we have the Maharaja Surya Rao Road and Maharani Chinnamamba Road. Now it's called Chinnamba Road, but originally Chinnamamba Road. That was the property of the Maharaja of Pitthapuram, one of the large zamindaris of Andhra Pradesh. The Maharaja of Pitthapuram, landholder, member of the Justice Party, very actively involved in the Dravidian politics of that era, when Telugu and Tamil both operated together for various reasons. So he was a member of that. But we remember more often his daughter Sita Devi of Baroda, who was the Zamindarini of Uyuru. And having met Pratap Singh Rao Gaikwad at the Gindi race course, They fall deeply in love, whether she fell in love with his diamonds or his pearls. He had rubies and pearls and plenty of girls, but he didn't know how to dance the rumba, as the song goes. So, like the Maharaja of Magador. But the point is that Sita Devi and Pratap Singh Rao decided to get married. He was already married to the devout Shanta Devi, and he had several children through her. Baroda rules did not allow for the king to have a second official wife. So they converted to Islam, got married, and then he reconverted back to Hinduism. The viceroy was not happy. But then the lawyers very cleverly argued that when he married, he was technically not the Maharaja because he had become a Muslim. And therefore he had got married at that point of time, and then he reconverted to becoming Hindu, but that marriage can all be annulled. So she will remain second Her Highness of Baroda. So that is how they carried on. Then, of course, it was well known all the excesses that Sita Devi practiced. They finally settled in France post-independence. By the time a suspiciously large amount of jewelry had vanished from the Baroda treasury and had made its way to France, where it was funding her extravagant lifestyle. In the meantime, independence had come, and Patel chose not to negotiate with either Pratap Singh Rao or Sita Devi, but he chose to negotiate with Shanta Devi and settled everything on her son, the Privy Purse, and Pratap Singh Rao effectively became persona non grata. He died a broken man, divorced from Sita Devi. Sita Devi and the son, they had one son. His name was, he was also always referred to as Princey. They were a fixture. Mother and son would be seen in all the social do's at Nice, Monte Carlo, all those places. They were very much, and they travelled in a Rolls Royce which had the Baroda elephants painted in yellow on both sides. Sita Devi always with her pearls. Sudden money was slowly, dwindling. Things were being sold repeatedly. Princey was a no good. He was gay. One day he died slitting his throat, surrounded by candles that he had lit all around himself. Sita Devi did not even know that her son was dead. She was in a coma by that time and eventually passed away. But that is a very interesting story that began in our own Alwarpet. They had... the Dunmore House was really the property that they had owned at one time. Today Dunmore House doesn't exist. There is only one wall that stands like that, a gate post. And that is at the end of Murray's Gate Road. It belonged to Levison Gower, who was one of the descendants of the Earl of Dunmore. And that is how the property was, Murray Levison Gower, who was one of the descendants of the Earl of Dunmore. And that's how the house, because it was at the end, that road came to get the name Murray's Gate Road. It led to Murray's Gate. It's now known as Murray's Gate Road. When you cannot change it, you Indianize it. And this particular locality has had a lot of interesting film history to it. So before I even go here, Dunmore House was where Wales Studios at one point of time existed, and Wales Studios was where Sati Leelavati was shot, which saw M.G. Ramachandran first becoming a film actor. Now, close by was also the Shobhanachala Studios, which was the property of the Zamindar of Mirzapuram. And his sons acquired the property from him and made it Venus Studios. Now, Venus Studios does not have anything to do with Venus Colony, because that was Ratnam Ayar's Venus Pictures, which was an entirely different entity altogether. They plotted that area and converted it into Venus Colony, where we also have Astika Samajam. Who can forget Astika Samajam with all its music performances, its Harikatha, Swengalipuram, Anantarama Krishnayar, so many, Anantarama Dikshitar, so many, performances over there. I have been taken myself as a child, and I can never forget the Ayodhya Kandam, I think it was, where he would describe the pathos of Dasharatha and he would weep, and my grandmother promptly fainted in the audience. And then she had to be carted home. And then my grandfather said, "Idellam poi kekka vendam, aathula padichunda porum, romba jaasthiya poiduthu." But it was that dramatic. He would say, "Rama," அப்படின்னார். உடனே எல்லாரும் front roll அப்படியே குலுங்கி அழுது, all kind. And then, Anantarama Dikshitar was a phenomenon. Because on one hand, he would elevate you like this. Apdiye Dasharatharval, Rama, apdinu solli, apdiye kizha vilunduttal. Next minute, he will say, Justice Somadeva Sharma angendu vandindirukar. இன்னைக்கு மெட்ராஸில் மழை பெய்யறதுனா இந்த மாதிரி நல்லவாள்லாம் இருக்கிறதுனால தான் காரணம். Suddenly from somewhere, Dasharatha dying and Justice Somadeva Sharma coming. Then he would advertise for, he would say, Pergolaxன்னு ஒரு மாத்திரை இருக்கு, அதை பண்ணுறவா வந்திருக்கா இன்னைக்கு, அதை சாப்பிட்டு எல்லாரும் சுகமாக இருக்கணும்னு பகவானை பிரார்த்தனை பண்ணிக்கிறேன். All kinds of things would happen in Anantarama Dikshithar's Harikatha performances. You had to be fortunate to have witnessed it. He was a character. And that was all in Astika Samaja. I have accompanied my grandmother at least 3 or 4 times, till that famous fainting episode after which grandfather imposed a ban. And said, the story goes that whenever grandmother got involved in the Ramayana, something like this happened. Apparently in our Trichy house, when Kishkinda Kandam was read, out of the blue monkeys descended on the property, and they had to be removed by some corporation or something like that. They became a menace. And when Lanka Dahanam was read, a neighbor's house caught fire. I don't know what she had against those people. But so after that, this party going to Harikathas became a kind of a no kind of situation in our house. But we come to KBS. KBS was given a property at the corner of Mowbrays Gate Road. KB Sundarambal was, in my opinion, one of the greatest, not just an artist, a woman. Because she was a woman who knew how to stand on her own legs. And a woman of outstanding principles, a woman of means, a woman of business, a woman who took care of all her relatives. She was an amazing personality. And when this Mowbrays Gate nonsense happened, I wrote to the corporation saying, if you want to rename it, name it after her. Call it KB Sundarambal Salai. But nothing ever happened. But she was a resident of that place for a very long time. Venus Pictures I have already covered. S.S. Rajendran lived at the corner of H.D. Raja Street. There was a huge bungalow there that bore his name for a long time. I think now it is called SSR Pankajam or something like that. That's a multi-storied building that stands in that location. Now we come to the other side, which is the Mowbrays Road side. So John de Monte acquires the properties of George Mowbray, 100 acres, and then finally when he dies, he wills it to the church, the Catholic Church, saying that the property cannot be sold, but it should be put to good use. Now the church was saddled with 100 acres and didn't know what to do with it, so every time it went to the court, acquired permission, and then sold bits and pieces. That's how Madras Club has 9 acres, the Consul General of the United States of America has 9 acres, Boat Club came, Archbishop Matthias Avenue came, Satyanarayana Avenue, all those areas came up. Some parts of it still remain with the church, like De Monte Colony, which cannot be sold, it remains with the church. And then there is Ben's Gardens, which is at the entrance of Boat Club Road, 9 acres once again, which is still lying derelict for a long time. It used to be the residence of the managing director of Bini. And now it is just lying vacant, and you can see 2 or 3 buildings in the midst of it. So that was the history of that property. But on this side, which is leading towards, the Boat Club area, you have on your left the Ethiraj Kalyana Mandapam. So that commemorates Ethiraj Amma, the woman on this side, who was the wife of Narayana Guruvayya. Narayana Guruvayya has the distinction of being the first Arya Vaishya to write a will and probate it in the High Court of Madras. Narayana Guruvayya, and his life history is given beautifully in that will. He says, I came to Madras as an orphan. I was adopted by a woman who took very good care of me. She made me get into business. I made a fortune making packing material for companies. And then I had a son through Ethirajamma. The son died, and his wife was married off again to someone else so some very forward person, obviously her father was, in that era. So he says, I have already settled what I had to on that daughter-in-law. The rest of the property is with me, and I am now leaving it to Ethirajamma, my wife, and after her it should be used for charitable purposes. And that is how the Ethiraj Kalyana Mandapam comes up, the proceeds of which still go to the Narayana Guruvayya Trust. Opposite that, you have the Maharashtra Nivas, which is the Maharashtra Association building, which commemorates so many years of Marathi residence of this particular city. And behind that, you had the residence of T.L. Venkatrama Ayar, now a multi-storied building. Justice T.L. Venkatrama Ayar, who was perhaps the only judge who also is a Sangeeta Kalanidhi of the Music Academy. Today, many people sadly don't think that is a qualification. But in those days, I think it was very differently viewed. And he was an authority on Muthuswami Dikshitar Kritis, and he was also a judge of the Supreme Court of India. And therefore, he remains the only judge who also became a Sangeeta Kalanidhi. Post-retirement, became president of the Music Academy, D.K. Patamal, B. Rajamayar, and all of them being his very famous students. After that, you have a house called Mithila. Mithila, the house of T.R. Ramchandra Rao, an aristocratic Marathi family, built in 1931. And one of the most beautiful bungalows that I have ever come across. The architect Sujata Shankar owns the property even today. And her father, Mr. Nagoji Rao, was a resident in that particular house till he and his wife passed away. One of the most beautiful houses that you can think of, and in every way reflective of how gracious this locality used to be at one point of time, how quiet it used to be, full of trees. Sadly, that property became metro rail eventually, and a large chunk of it has now been taken over for building a station. But Mithila still survives, and long may it survive, as an example of what a good house should be. After that, we come to the properties of Justice K.P. Lakshman Rao. And Justice K.P. Lakshman Rao, his detractors said that it was only because he could play tennis with Lady Willingdon that he became a judge of the High Court of Madras, but I don't believe that. I'm sure he must have been a man of great merit. He owned a huge property there, and in the 1940s, the Madras Government Servants Cooperative Society, which developed Gopalapuram in 1924, decided that it would acquire 200 grounds and plot it into 42 plots. And that is the Sriram Nagar that we know of today. So that's how Sriram Nagar comes into existence. And, it still is a very beautiful, quiet housing area. This was T.R. Ramchandra Rao, not the man who built Mithila, but his grandfather. He was the first Indian to become the Deputy Commissioner of Police of Madras city. And his grandson would be the one who would build Mithila, the house. So I mixed up the pictures. How can we not have a story of Park Sheraton over here? So this was the location where there was a house belonging to the Mercantile Bank, and that was known as Adyar Gate House. Because it faced the Adyar Club Gate, the house was known as Adyar Gate House. And in the 1970s, T.T. Vasu, who was very much a visionary, though sadly he rarely ever executed a project to its fullest extent, but he certainly was a man of great vision, and we need to celebrate him for that. Vasu was the one who hit upon this idea that the city didn't have sufficient number of five-star hotels in it. And he believed that a time would come when there would be a huge market for it. So he initially tried to have a collaboration with Holiday Inn, and that did not work out. The property was acquired. There were other partners. They suddenly withdrew. There were FERA problems. All kinds of things happened. The project dragged on forever and ever and ever. Finally, the Goyals stepped in and decided to finance the construction of the hotel, acquiring a major stake in the property. And that is when the Sheraton was also brought in as a collaboration. It was Vasu who organized that collaboration as well and saw to the completion of the hotel. So it was known as the Adyar Club Gate Hotel, Adyar Gate Hotel. And Vasu was chairman of that company. Afterwards, I'm sure many of you will remember, for years the telephone operator on picking up would say, "Welcome to the Welcome Group, Park Sheraton, Adyar Gate Hotel." That is how they would announce it. And later it would become Crown Plaza. The most famous feature of Park Sheraton was Dakshin. It's South Indian restaurant, and that was Vasu's idea. And Vasu also brought his cook, an Ayar, to supply the short eats. And that became Ayar's trolley. And he also brought in degree coffee by the yard. In front of you, they will take the tumbler and dawra and do that. and make, they would wave the coffee, and that was a miracle for foreigners. They would keep watching it. So today there is no Park Sheraton, no Crown Plaza, nothing, but Dakshin still survives. And Ayar's trolley still survives. And they still do a degree coffee by the yard over there. So, spirit of Vasu, somewhere along, I was very fond of the man, so I can only say that wherever he is, he must be very happy. On the Pittapuram side, we come to a very old family that promoted what was then known as the Union Company. K. Gopalakrishna was a Dubash in Gillanders, Arbuthnot and Company, after which he decided to get into business and started Union Motors, Union Company, which was into spare parts dealing, and eventually post-independence would set up Standard Motors. And that is how we remember them today. Standard Motors is not in existence anymore, but the UCAL group still flourishes, part of what Gopalakrishna did so many years ago, and the family members still live on that side of the Teynampet property. Before I come to Kasturi Estate, which is almost my end of the story, I'd just like to read out a couple of passages. One is from Ashokamithran's Oru Parvaiyil Chennai Nagaram. I'm taking the English translation, where he says that he talks about Alwarpet and Teynampet, and I'm just going to read a very relevant passage because it meanders a little here and there. Would you believe that there was a time when rice paddy was planted in these parts? We've looked at all that. And then he says the places that are today called Kasturi Estate, Chola Sheraton Hotel and Russian Cultural Center were all green fields some 35 years ago. These days, many wealthy and influential dignitaries of Chennai live there. Hema Malini, who reigned as the #1 Hindi film star for 15 years, had her house and a dance school in this area. Kamal Hassan, who has donned several film roles from a little boy to a grand old man, and after this book was written as a woman as well, I must add, had also bought a house in this field and embarked on his wedded life there. At a little distance was an old film studio, and he talks about Shovanachala. And then he says, if we visit Alwarpet village, we can readily recognize that Alwarpet is a very old residential settlement, bounded by Eldams Road and Chemiers Road. Even today, when he wrote it, you can find many old tile houses and provision stores. Alwarpet Pillayar and Teynampet Subramanya Swami temples are famous. They attract a large number of devotees. Somehow, while the Subramanya Swami temple looks prosperous, the older brother's temple is very modest. The present-day Vastu experts would venture to attribute the temple's location in a triangular corner as a cause for its lack of popularity. Adjacent to this temple is a peepal tree. On the first floor of an old house abutting this temple, writer Jayakanthan used to meet his friends. His friends and foes alike called this a madam. The place had some elements of distinction of a madam. Writers congregated there. Some 7-8 people were always present. It is really a wonder how Jayakanthan managed to create so many literary works in such an ambience. As the two Teynampets, Vanniya and Vellala, you must remember that Teynampet had two parts, Vanniyar Teynampete, Vellalar Teynampete. Of course, since 1975, we live in a caste-free society, as you all know, and so we have done away with these names. But he writes, as the two Teynampets were fairly close to Gemini and Shovanachala film studios, this area had a sizable number of film production crew. Bharati Raja, Bhagyaraj, Ilayaraja are readily recognizable to the present generation. Those days, supporting actors, group dance artists and participants in crowd scenes were all living in the alleys and bylanes in this area. One day, they would be the citizens in Pandya Nedunchezhiyan's reign. On another day, they would be mill workers under a stingy capitalist. One day, they would don a beggar's role. The next day would be as a liveried servant in a royal court. Then the dancing girls of Teynampet, when they were not dancing in Sathanur Dam or in Mamallapuram, they would be dancing in film studios. There would be no link at all between their laughter and superficial jollity on the one hand, and the predicament of their lives on the other. They all deserve the Kalaimamani award. And then he describes the Music Academy and all that, which I'm not going to go into. But we now come to what is known as Kasturi Estate. Kasturi estate itself acquired in the 1920s by Kasturi Rangayengar, the then proprietor of the Hindu. And later in 1938 converted into a private limited known as Kasturi Estates Limited. It had only 3 houses, and if you extend it a little, 5 houses at most, spanning an area that begins at the corner of Kasturi Ranga Road and then going all the way up to JJ Road and also next to Nardagana Sabha. So it was a very irregular kind of a plot that spanned this entire area. The original houses were Tilak Bhavan, which is where the Fortune Hotel is today, and where Mahatma Gandhi for the first time had this vision of, Satyagraha, and which even today there is a stone that commemorates that vision at that particular location. So there was Tilak Bhavan, and then there was Sabarmati, which was where today Agarwal Hospital has got its temporary accommodation. And then you had farmhouse, which still is farmhouse estate, which is where next to Nardagana Sabha. That's a private compound now with a few houses. Those were the 3 houses. You also had a house called Hrishikesh, which is in the first cutting at the entrance of Parthsarthi Gardens. That house also was there. And if I am not mistaken, there was one more. So these were the 5 houses. Later on, the Hindu family decided to develop the property, particularly during the Urban Land Ceiling Act of the 1970s. 2 great properties of this area bit the dust in the Urban Land Ceiling Act. One was Kasturi Estate, which had to be plotted and developed at 5,000 rupees a ground at that time. And even that money was not available with many of the people to whom it was thrust. And they were told it is enough if you pay an advance and you can pay the rest later. We will just do the registration so that the land does not go into the hands of the government. The other property that also bit the dust was a house called Soundarya that was roughly on the opposite side of the grove. Soundarya was the property of the descendants of P.R. Sundara Ayar, who used to live in a house known as Shri Bagh, where Amritanjan is today, next to Nageshwar Rao Park. They had speculated in German hardware, and then the Second World War broke out and the whole family was declared insolvent, barring one minor, and his interests were protected by the court. And therefore it was in his name that the house Soundarya plot was acquired, purchased. They began Soundarya Nursery. And that is how Soundarya as a name came about. Soundarya Nursery later shifting to Mount Road. And then an early example of land grab by doctrine of lapse. But we don't have to go into that at this point of time. But Soundarya Nursery vanished that way. Soundarya as a house was acquired by the family of the MD brothers. In the early 1900s, they were big timber merchants. Doraswami Ayar and brothers. So Doraswami Ayar was the first brother, Chakravarti Ayar was the second brother, third was Sudarshanam Ayar, and the fourth was Seshadri Ayar. So Seshadri Ayar's family used to live in Soundarya. Sudarshanam Ayar's family used to live on Radhakrishnan, Edward Elliott's Road in a house known as Manonidhi. Doraswami Ayar's family lived in Georgetown. I am yet to establish where Chakravarti Ayar family lived. But they were very big into timber. And there is this very interesting story about how when M.S. Padmanabhan, Padumama as I used to refer to him, Mukund Padmanabhan's father, he was one of the descendants of the family, and apparently he went and told Ariyakudi Ramanuja Ayar, "Nanu inniki enga family lendu mara business la erangiten." Whereupon Ariyakudi, I believe, said, "Adinala dhaan Vishnu Sahasranamathila vandu Padmanabho Maraprabhu or line irukku pola irukku." I believe he is supposed to have said this. So that was the family. And when the Urban Land Ceiling Act came, I believe even their tailor was given land, saying just take it, otherwise it's going to go waste. And that is how that old Soundarya was brought down. There was a house called Seshadri that stood there for a long period of time, which was where the sons of Seshadri Ayar used to live, and now that also has become a multi-storied building. Now the last portion of this presentation, very last, 2 stories. One is, I get this call so often. Every month I'll get either a message or a call. Bharathidasan Roadukku pazhaya per enna? When I tell them there was no old name for Bharathidasan Road, they refuse to believe me. They say, Kadayadu sir, there must have been a name. The point is, there was no connection between Mount Road and Eldams Road and Mowbrays Road at that place. There was only properties at that end and properties at this end, and that road is a very late development. It's only from the 1960s, early 70s, and it came to be known as Bharathidasan Road. There was no earlier name for it. The other end of it, of course, is defined by this gentleman who believed that if you wanted to run an institution, you had to endow it with real estate. If you didn't have real estate, there was no point in existing. And he not only did it for New College, he acquired such a big property from the Thakur Sahib of Limdi and gave it to the New College so that they would continue to flourish. And look at the number of institutions that have come up in that campus. The other was the SIET College, the South Indian Educational Trust. He writes in his biography, I was a firm believer in the power of real estate. And the third great organization that he made sure is still living off his vision, Music Academy. He was a committee member, he was a vice president. They were going to buy 2,400 square feet of land in Triplicane in a house called Devi Sadan and put up the music. Can you imagine Music Academy in Triplicane in 2,400 square feet? And Bashir was the man who shouted and screamed himself hoarse and said, you can't build an institution on property of that size. There is 21 grounds coming up on auction on TTK Road belonging to Mount Venugopala, not TTK Road, on Edward Elliot's Road, belonging to Mount Venugopala Pillai. Acquire the property. And they said, we don't have money. He said, borrow. So that is how they, how a tambram can borrow, right? You perjure your soul in the process of borrowing. So they Kadan Petrar, Nenjambol, Kalanginan, Ilangai Vendan. So there's people who have never read Kambaramayana, unlike Mr. Hande, Dr. Hande, they will all quote this line, of course. So everybody will know. So, but with great reluctance, Academy went and borrowed. And today, look at the vision of that one individual who was able to create it. Bashir Ahmed Saeed himself lived on a huge property known as Sadar Gardens at the end of Ambujamal Road and what is called Bashyam Bashir Ahmed Road today. That was once the Sadar Dibani Adalat. That was the civil courts for Madras in the 18th century. And today, when you are climbing up the Alwarpet flyover, before you take that deathly turn to the left, if you look to your right, if you can manage to look to your right, there is a building called Midtown or something. That was a house called Sadar Gate. That was the gate towards the Sadar Gardens, which is where he acquired the court property and he was living there, Southern Gardens. And when the question came up whom to name it after, because Bashir was at one end, the other was K. Bhashyam, who was living on Alwarpet Circle in a house called Champaka Vilas, which is today Professor P.A. Palanisamy Apartments. The Corporation Commissioner said, we'll name it after both. And that is how it came to be known as Bashyam Bashir Ahmed Road. So now nobody is willing to believe these kind of stories. So the signboard says Bashim Bashir Ahmed Road. They are trying to, somehow they feel more comfortable that way. So they've decided to call it Bashim Bashir Ahmed. So that is how that particular street is named. But we now come to the Alwarpet Pillai I have covered, Balasubramanian Sula, I have come to the last slide. Lust Church Road, going from here towards Mylapore is that location. At one point of time, if you were a big lawyer, you had to have a house on Lust Church Road. If you didn't have it on Lust Church Road, then you didn't count. Your knighthood was in jeopardy. But let's read from Ambujamal's biography about how Lust Church Road was when Father Sriman Srinivasa Iyengar, after whom there is a road named over here. Ambujamal also has a street named after here. And she says that they went and saw it for the first time, 150 grounds. Amjad Bagh was the name of the property. Father, mother, Ambujamal, brother Parthsarthi all went and saw it. They were small children. House was in a terrible rundown condition. And there was an old gardener who gave them some flowers and all that. And then when they came back, father asked mother, what did you think? She said, I hated the property. He said, I've just paid the advance and we are shifting there. So thereafter they moved in, and then she talks about the kitchen at Amjad Bagh when completed in 1911 was a small bungalow by itself. My father spent rupees 20,000 transforming the main house as well. This was in 1911, 20,000 rupees. Once the work was done, we shifted back into Amjad Bagh. Several rooms had come up on a foundation of granite and cement, but somehow the house lacked modernity. The first hall in it was a formal drawing room, after which came a ladies' room. A large room nearby was my father's office. The first floor had a large hall and 2 bedrooms. In the initial days of shifting in, we found living here to be a daunting prospect in Luschurch Road. There was hardly any footfall or vehicular traffic on the road. The Bhimannapet and cooperative bank areas of today were all banana plantations. Bhimannapet is Bhimanna Mudali Street. Cooperative bank area is where the Sivagami Petachi Auditorium and now the metro station and the famous bank Anumar Kovil is. These are all that particular locality. The Norton bungalow was in the neighboring De Silva Road. To the rear of Amjad Bagh was a large bungalow named Hermitage. To the west was Sir V.C. Desikacharya's bungalow. Opposite us was the residence of Ramachandra Rao Sahib and the garden of Srinivasa Ayar. Close to Luz were the residences of Sir K. Srinivasa Iyengar and Baroda Srinivasa Iyengar. On the east was Sir T. Madhav Rao's bungalow, and in Luz, next to the Mylapore Club, was the residence of P.R. Sundaram Ayar and a tank named the Arada Kuttai. That is today's Nageshwara Rao Pantulu Park. Opposite the club was Lakshmi Vilas and the bungalows of Buchi Babu and V. Krishnaswamy Ayar. All these houses were situated in the midst of vast gardens, so the atmosphere was always quiet. Not a day went by without a rat snake or a crate or a cobra emerging from the weeds. The gardener would club them to death. During the rains, the 3 ponds in the middle of the banana plantations would fill up with frogs, and they kept up a chorus of croaks right through the night. At around midnight, jackals would begin braying. Bhimannapet and Luschurch Road being lonely thoroughfares, any woman who stepped out by herself was bound to lose her jewelry and cash. On hearing their screams, we would rush out of the bungalow, but the miscreants would have vanished. Every morning when elderly women would come to collect the fallen banyan, jackfruit and peepal leaves, their belongings would meet with the same fate. Skirmishes between those dwelling in the hutments of Bhimannapet and those in Mandavali were matters of routine. Quite often, armed groups from one would chase those belonging to the other right up to Luschurch Road. Seasons when cholera and smallpox epidemics flared up filled us with fear. At least 3 or 4 dead bodies would make their way each day along Bhimannapet to the cries of Govinda, Govinda. I don't think we can ever go back to such a Luschurch Road ever in this life or the next. We've completely lost out on that. So I'm sure there is a lot more that can be said about these localities, but I will finish my talk here today with just giving you a glimpse. And I'm sure I've, for instance, left out Vanaja, who was one of the better known Gemini dancers of whom Ashokamitran writes, who had a house there. There were so many others worthy of mention. But I thank you all for the patient hearing, and happy Madras Day, even though it was yesterday. Thank you.
Where is Alwarpet in all this? Because, there's no Alwarpet post office. It's Teynampet post office, yet I'm told that I live in Alwarpet. So where is Teynampet, where is Alwarpet?
It's very interesting that you should ask this question. There is an Alwarpet street. If you go further down on Mowbrays Road, and it connects Teynampet. So Alwarpet Street is actually in Teynampet. So when it clearly marks the boundary of the old village. And according to Ashokamitran, that Kudaya Kovind, which is by the tree, the demon tree, that was the boundary of Alwarpet.
And on the south side?
You mean going towards the Hunter Company itself would qualify as Alwarpet only, if you look at it that way, because its definition as Raja Annamalappuram is only a 1970s phenomenon.
So, okay. And on the east?
East is, I guess, what we're talking about is towards Dust Church Road. Dust Church Road itself would be the boundary because then it's on Mylapore.
I express my sincere thanks to Sriram for accepting our invitation and delivering a highly informative lecture. You also told us some fascinating stories. Thank you, sir. I thank the professors, students, and teachers from our school and research scholars from our institute for the presence today. My special thanks to all the participants for your presence in this inclement weather condition. I express my gratitude to the media people for the continuous support. We have organized an exhibition of Who's Who, Identify Your Ancestors and Friends in our main gallery, CP Art Center. Please do visit. I express my thanks to all my colleagues who supported and cooperated to organize this lecture and exhibition. Once again, I thank you all. Thank you.